When you look at the history of the United States, there's one thing that just keeps showing up again and again: conflict. From a scrappy rebellion against a global empire to becoming, well, the leader of a new world order. Today, we're going to dive into how more than 2 centuries of war didn't just shake the nation, it forged a superpower. So that's the big question we're tackling, right? How did 200 years of nearly constant conflict, both inside its borders and out, create the country we see today? It's a heck of a story, one filled with ideology, massive expansion, and moments that almost tore the whole thing apart. All right, so here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the fight for independence, then move into the brutal conflicts that shape the continent. After that, we'll see America step onto the world stage, and then explore that high-stakes superpower standoff of the Cold War. And finally, we'll look at the true cost and what it all means today. Let's start right at the beginning. Chapter 1, Forging an Independent Nation. This is all about how a bunch of colonies decided to fight not just for land, but for a whole new idea of what a country could be. See, the American Revolution wasn't just some disagreement over taxes. I mean, that was part of it, sure, but it was a full-blown ideological and political war. The goal was huge: to completely break away from an empire and build something brand new, something the world hadn't really seen before, a nation supposedly built on self-governance. Now, check out the scale of that fight. You've got about 217,000 colonists who served to make that idea a reality. But what's really wild is that last date. The final veteran of the revolution died in 1869. Think about that. That means the living, breathing memory of the nation's birth overlapped with the generation that was fighting the Civil War. History's a lot closer than we think. But getting independence wasn't a one-and-done deal. The War of 1812 was like the critical sequel. It was a messy, tough fight. I mean, the White House was literally burned down. But in the end, the U.S. proved it could go toe-to-toe with a global empire and survive. Not just once, but twice. After that, its place on the world stage was pretty much solidified. So the young nation is secure. Now what? Well, that brings us to Chapter 2, a continent shaped by conflict. The focus turns inward, and it turns westward, and the wars that came next would define America's borders and, in a really tragic way, test its very soul. And you can't talk about this era without understanding this one powerful idea: manifest destiny. This was the core belief that the U.S. was basically destined, some even said God-ordained, to expand all the way across the continent. It wasn't just seen as a land grab, it was framed as spreading a better way of life, and that idea was used to justify a lot of the conflict that was about to happen.
And here you go. This is manifest destiny in action. The Mexican-American War was a direct result of that ambition. In just a couple of years, the United States acquired a huge amount of territory. We're talking California, Arizona, New Mexico. The map of the continent was literally redrawn.
Of course, that expansion came at a terrible price. For the better part of a century, that push west fueled what we call the Indian Wars. And this wasn't just one war. It was a long, brutal series of conflicts, forced removals, and broken promises. As the U.S. government cleared land for settlers and railroads, devastating countless Native American tribes in the process.
And while all of this was happening out west, the country was tearing itself apart from the inside. The issue of slavery, which was tied directly to those new territories, finally just exploded. The result was the Civil War. That number, over 500,000 dead, on both sides. That was the unbelievable cost of keeping the nation together and finally abolishing slavery.
Okay, so the continent is conquered, and the Union, though scarred, is preserved. Now, America's gaze starts to turn outward. This is Chapter 3, Emergence on the World Stage. This is when the nation really begins to flex its industrial and military muscle across the globe. And the real turning point was the Spanish-American War in 1898. It was a pretty short war, but its impact was massive. For the first time, the U.S. threw its military weight around overseas and walked away with an empire of its own, places like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. America wasn't just a big country anymore. It was a global power. And just look at how fast things escalated from there. This chart is just staggering. You go from about 300,000 service members in the Spanish-American War to over 4.7 million in World War I, and then an almost unbelievable 16 million in World War II. In less than 50 years, America's military commitment to global conflict just grew exponentially. This is the superpower being born. Which brings us to Chapter 4, the superpower standoff. After World War II, the dust settles, and there are really only two giants left standing: the United States and the Soviet Union. And what came next wasn't another hot war, but a totally new kind of global conflict, a 45-year-long ideological battle for the planet. At its core, the Cold War was a fight over two completely different versions of the future. On one side, you had the US pushing democracy and capitalism. On the other, the Soviet Union, exporting communism and authoritarianism. The US's goal was to contain communism, the USSR's goal was to spread it, and that clash defined pretty much everything for the next half-century. So, to fight this battle, the US came up with a policy called containment. The idea was pretty simple: stop the Soviet Union from expanding its influence anywhere it tried to pop up. It wasn't about invading Russia, it was about building a political and military wall around it, and helping any nation that was threatened by a communist takeover. And this one idea would drag America into conflicts all over the globe. And here's the heartbreaking human cost of that containment policy. The Cold War never got hot between the two superpowers, but it was fought through these incredibly brutal proxy wars. In just Korea and Vietnam, you have over 80,000 Americans who died fighting to hold that line against communism, not to mention the millions of Koreans and Vietnamese who lost their lives. So why didn't it ever turn into a direct war? Well, the answer is one terrifying acronym: MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. Both sides built up these insane nuclear arsenals, so big that if one side launched, the other would launch back, and it would mean the complete end of, well, everybody. It's this bizarre paradox where the threat of total annihilation is what actually kept the peace. So after all that, after 2 centuries of almost nonstop conflicts, what's the final tally? That brings us to our last chapter, the legacy. What was the total cost? And maybe more importantly, how are we remembering it? Or are we? The numbers here are just sobering. From the revolution up to 1991, almost 42 million Americans served in wartime. Over 650,000 of them died in battle, and another 300,000 died from other causes while deployed. This is the cumulative human price tag for building and defending the nation we've been talking about. But statistics can sometimes feel a little abstract. This makes it personal. The last living link to World War I, Frank Buckles, died just over a decade ago. A war that literally redrew the modern world was, until very, very recently, still a living memory. But that direct human connection to our past, it's disappearing fast. And this just shows you how fast that's happening. Look at the numbers for World War II vets. Right now, there are an estimated 84,000 left. Just 2 years from now, that's expected to be cut in half. And by 2036, fewer than 400. We are literally on the verge of losing that entire generation that fought the last great global war. Which leaves us with a pretty heavy final question. For generations, Americans were defined by these huge conflicts. But as the living, breathing memory of these massive global wars just fades away, what's going to guide us? What lessons from this long and often very bloody history are we going to choose to remember, and which ones will we just let ourselves forget? That's really a question for all of us.